So my name is Jenna DeAngelo. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm the Associate Director for Local and Regional Fiscal Health at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. The Lincoln Institute is a private operating foundation. We seek to improve quality of life through the effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land. So we are here today to talk about what the state of Michigan can do to improve the fiscal health of its local governments. Why should we worry about the fiscal health of local governments, you ask? Well, localities provide the services you interact with every day. They provide running water, trash pickup, fire protection, and all the other things you might not think about on a daily basis, but that you as residents benefit from, like street lights at night so that you can drive home safely. So the Lincoln Institute, with a grant from the Mott Foundation, began this project in Michigan almost 2 years ago. We've spoken with dozens of people in Michigan. We've convened stakeholders for in-person and virtual discussions, and we've conducted extensive research. As you can see on the agenda, we're going to briefly present our research findings. You'll hear from a state representative from South Dakota about their experience in passing a bill that helped increase revenues available to local governments. And then we'll have a stakeholder discussion and we'll take questions from the audience. There should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, please type them in as we go. So next, I would like to introduce Amy Hovey. She's a special projects coordinator at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. She's going to give some opening remarks. I will hand it over to Amy.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's discussion. As Michigan looks to create greater economic opportunities for everyone, a serious examination of how the system of municipal finance impedes or accelerates a thriving economy is crucial. Most municipalities in Michigan do not have enough resources to provide adequate funding for basic services and amenities that contribute to a quality of life. Local governments have been forced to cut, and cut some more. Michigan communities deserve better. We know that in today's environments, job follows people. Michigan communities must be able to provide vibrant places that people want to live. The Mott Foundation is happy to support the exploration of how we in Michigan can do better. And I look forward to today's conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. All right, I'm going to try to seamlessly switch back to my PowerPoint. Not so seamless, apologies. There we go. Oh gosh, did it. All right. Let us get into the research report. So most of you are probably from Michigan and you probably already know these problems. You've heard them before. So I won't go into too much details on them, but the four that we focused our research on were cuts to statutory revenue sharing, strict limitations on property taxes, limited local government revenue options, and local government fragmentation. So even before COVID-19, many Michigan local governments were headed for fiscal distress. This pandemic has unfortunately only sped up the inevitable. We've seen Michigan local governments get property tax increases passed when the increase is earmarked to something specific that the community thinks is a necessary expense. But a tax increase to cover general local government costs would likely be met with opposition from residents. Further, some places are already at their max or about to reach their max limit of their taxing power. This forces localities to rely heavily on spending cuts to balance their budgets, and those cuts can be done in an inequitable way, such that some residents are disproportionately affected by reduced services. I'd like to give a shout out to my colleagues at the Lincoln Institute who just put on a webinar yesterday about that issue of cutting budgets equitably, and that webinar recording should be up on our website soon. So the first issue we focused on was revenue sharing. In Michigan, they have constitutional revenue sharing and statutory revenue sharing, both funded through the state sales tax. And our focus has been on, or was on, statutory revenue sharing, because as you can see in the graph, it's been declining over the years. And statutory revenue sharing's formula is need-based. So this decline in aid means that places that likely need the funds the most are losing out on funds. So while many states cut aid to local governments during and after the Great Recession, the cuts in Michigan were considerably larger than in most other states. From 2007 to 2017, per capita unrestricted state aid for municipalities declined 31% in Michigan, compared to 18% nationwide. And out of the 17 states where unrestricted aid accounted for at least 5% of municipal general revenues, Michigan had the 5th largest drop in unrestricted state aid for municipalities. So our recommendation, obviously, is to fully fund statutory revenue sharing. And how do you do this? So there's two ways. One is to put a lockbox on the funds that are meant to go to the local governments. There's a special state fund that earmarks the money to the local governments, but the state has been able to dip into that in the past to balance its budget. So we propose, put on a lockbox on it, and they can't touch it. Only money comes out of that fund if it's going to the local governments. We looked at other states that had these similar type of funds, and the majority of states that earmark funds for local governments have this special state fund. The other recommendation is to increase the sales tax or another state tax that will boost the state's revenue so that they don't need to dip into the sales tax revenues that are meant to go to the local governments. There are so many examples of recent state tax increases. There's the motor fuel tax rate in Alabama that was increased, the excise tax for alcohol in Connecticut that was increased. I could go on. So the next challenge that we looked at was the property tax limitations. They are very strict in Michigan compared to other states. Most states use one of three types of property tax limits: the rate limit, assessment limit, and levy limit. But Michigan uses all three of them. For example, reductions in mill rates are required when the property tax base grows rapidly, but increases in mill rates when the property tax base grows slowly or declines is only allowed with an override vote by the residents. Another example is that the assessment limit and levy limit restrict annual increases to the rate of inflation. And Michigan uses the consumer price index to measure inflation, which is lower than most other states' restrictions. To further drive the point home, 3 studies that looked at tax and expenditure limits across the states ranked Michigan either 2nd or 6th in being the most restrictive. So probably the main reason Michigan has these strict limitations is because residents and businesses fear the property tax will become too great a burden. And as such, legislators put in place these laws so that doesn't happen. With the most recently available data, we can see that the property tax as a % of personal income in Michigan is not very high compared to US and other nearby states. So while a high tax burden may have been an issue in the past, it doesn't appear to be that way today. So our recommendations for dealing with the property tax limitations is to allow local governments to raise their mill rates when the tax base grows slowly without an override vote. And that's key because the override vote that's required by residents can be burdensome. And then the other recommendation is to use a better measure of inflation for the state's levy limit. And there are a couple different measurements that could be used. You could use the implicit price deflator. You could use growth in state personal income. We know that Indiana uses that. There we go. So the next challenge is local revenue options. And as you can see on the screen, localities in Michigan are restricted in the types of local taxes that they can assess and collect. But revenue diversification has consistently been proven to be a determinant of local fiscal stability. Yet Michigan localities lack the ability to diversify their revenues, thus limiting their ability to adapt to changing circumstances, like right now with COVID. Several states have recently enabled municipalities to collect additional local taxes or increase the rates for existing local taxes. For example, the sales tax on marijuana in Massachusetts and California, or the wheelage tax in Minnesota. So our recommendation for dealing with the local revenue issue is to allow counties to levy one new tax or fee. And then from that, one of two things would happen. The counties would take over delivery of one service from something that the cities, townships, and villages would normally deliver, or the counties could distribute the new revenues to the local government units that are in its jurisdiction. And the reason we went this route in the recommendation is because, giving every city, township, village the ability to levy their own tax would just further exacerbate the fiscal disparities that already exist among all the local governments in Michigan. So the last challenge I focused on was government fragmentation. And as you can see, Michigan has a lot of different local governments. There's counties, cities, villages, townships, and over 1,000 special purpose districts. Having so many different levels of government, some of which provide the same or similar services as others, can create inefficiencies. And these inefficiencies can lead to wasted taxpayer dollars. While many think that consolidation is a way to improve government fragmentation, evidence suggests that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so that's not one of the things we want to recommend. We also know that local governments in Michigan have been trying to deal with inefficiencies, and they've been doing shared services and all of that, but it's not widespread, and there's opportunity for more collaboration. So our recommendation for this challenge is that the state should encourage and enable the localities to experiment with different forms of service delivery. One of the models is government as a platform, and that is where local governments act as a coordinator by plugging in the most effective service provider of the basic public services. And that's regardless of who the provider is, whether that's private business, nonprofit, the government itself, citizens. And then the other model is a networked enterprise, which connects actors in the pursuit of a shared vision and objectives, and it multiplies their collective power to achieve that objective by tying them together in a system of mutual accountability. The shared objective can be something like reducing poverty or improving high school graduation rates. And the Government Finance Officers Association actually just published some great research material on those two models that I'd encourage you to go look on their website. And so overall, we had a lot of recommendations, obviously, but the main takeaway is that we think one or two policies that get at the local government revenues issue should be coupled with one policy that addresses local government fragmentation and the inefficiencies. There has to be a compromise from both sides here. The state needs to take measures that bolster the fiscal health of localities, but the localities should in turn engage in efficient governance practices. So that is the end of my presentation on the research report. I'd like to introduce Jean Hunhoff, who is currently a Republican state representative in South Dakota. She's been a member of the state legislature since 2001. And before that, she worked in local government as a city commissioner and as a city mayor. So Jean is going to talk to us about getting Senate Bill 1 passed back in 2015 in South Dakota. Take it away, Jean.
Thank you, Jenna. And greetings from the great state of South Dakota, land of infant variety. It's been interesting as you were doing a review on the state of Michigan, some new terms, villages, certainly I'm not familiar with that, but infrastructure and especially the surface is certainly an issue for all states. And we all have some similar challenges and we all have some difference. In South Dakota, our populations are on the west and eastern end of the state. And so when you average that out, we talk about 12 people per square mile. So distance is a big issue and roads are a priority in South Dakota. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Senate Bill 1 that was passed in 2015. And I will preface my remarks by saying that Senator Mike Valley, who was at that time was from Mitchell, South Dakota, he really was the prime sponsor and he championed this bill. He is a banker and he also was involved with the railroad industry in South Dakota. So he had a tie-in to understand how infrastructure was important in our state. I will also tell you that South Dakota, as you know, is a red state and it's very conservative. So anytime you're talking about any kind of tax increases, it raises the ire of most citizens. The approach to do this road and bridge funding legislation really came up years before. And Senator Valley had started working on this in 13 and 14, and there were some drafts that were done, but again, they couldn't get the support. So I think the big issue that had surfaced is how do we get the partners and find the partners to collaborate together so that there are winners in this whole scenario as we want to increase the different tax levels that I'll talk about so that we can support infrastructure. I think the other issue, this is really about bridge funding because we are very much in the rural areas. Our bridges are outdated and certainly they take a lot of pressure in the sense agriculture is #1 in the state of South Dakota. So you've got a lot of heavyweight traffic on those roads and bridges and they're the sustainability to get their products to market. So what Senator Valley did is he identified who were to be included in the collaboration. How do you build that foundation? And again, where does the taxation for the infrastructure come from? Well, you look at townships, you look at counties, and you look at the state, you look at gas tax, both state and federal. And so he orchestrated the year before starting having work groups with all of the groups that I have mentioned. Started in small to talk about what were the needs out there, what was currently being done, how big was the need for bridge reemplacement and also for the road infrastructure. We have a very good South Dakota Department of Transportation and they have a very good maintenance program, but we could tell from the maintenance program that, you know, our interstate systems, because of the priority and federal funding, we're supporting and we were where we needed to be, but we saw our state highways and certainly our county highways and these bridges to be really under fire. We needed to do something. So he brought the people together, met in small groups, and even met in economic groups. So he would bring ag together. He would bring, again, the county association, the township association, economic development in the communities, because we all depend upon that. And what was a result was Senate Bill 1. And I'm going to talk about the pieces of that because I think the pieces that are important are how do you get winners in each of these categories for the local levels of government. The first thing they looked at is how does local government get some dollars? Again, through taxation, but how does it stay at the local level? So after much discussion and piloting of different options that they're out there, what they decided to do was that, first of all, non-commercial vehicles over 20,000 pounds to 70% of the commercial rate were going to be assessed, and they were going to generate $2.5 million. At the same time, we did a 20% increase to license plate fees of about 14.8 million in the proposal. So if you took those two totals and they went to local governments, that's about $17.3 million. Then we knew we needed to do something with the biggest portion of where that tax was going to come from, and that's gas tax. And South Dakota is low on state gas tax. Again, there's been a reason for that. And again, ethanol is very important in the state of South Dakota, certainly growing in usage of that. And right now you get a 1 cent discount on ethanol if you buy it at the pump. And so you needed to keep that relationship that we wanted to support the production of corn for ethanol and to increase the usage of the product. So we were able to convince the industry, let's look at a 6 cent increase in ethanol alcohol. That would raise about 2.25 million. We then looked at the motor vehicle excise tax, people paying for new vehicles. We increased that from 3 to 4%, and that would generate 27.2 million. And finally, we looked at a 6 cent increase in motor vehicle tax to generate about 39 million. If you put those three pots together, we now had a state highway fund of about $68.45 million. Now, one of the things that the Department of Transportation educated us about is that it's very difficult to use those federal funds on the state highways and on townships. But what could be done is that we could substitute state dollars for those local projects. And the other thing is, when you look at federal dollars, those of you that are familiar with that, when you're using them for highway projects, they mandate higher costs. Just they're more expensive in the kind of oversight, what kind of design planning. I'm not technical in that area, but certainly added to the costs. So if we could substitute state dollars for some of those projects, use the federal dollars where we needed to use them, that would free up those regulations and actually reduce the costs that were associated with county and state highway roads. So we were able to do that. And that was really an incentive because we could do that swap of dollars. The other thing we realized was that we had to do something, the counties had to be players in this, and certainly counties are tight for dollars. I don't know in your other states, but we certainly have a finite how much they could raise taxes. So what we implemented in there, we said that we would allow counties to assess between 60 cents and $1.20 per $1,000 of taxable property valuation for the road needs in their county. And again, it depended on what the county was currently doing for total valuable taxation. And we told townships that they could assess up to 50 cents per thousand for their road needs. So we created the new dollars. Now, how are we going to use those? So what we did is we created this local government bridge project fund. So when I go back to talk about the non-commercial vehicles that we increased and the increase on license plates that went directly to local governments, whatever they raised there, that in totality in South Dakota raised about 17.3 million. We took 7 million annually. We take out of that fund that is raised. The rest goes to local government, whatever they do for their taxation and whatever they have in those increases in those areas. In the second pot, where we raise those gas taxes, that generates about $68.45 million. And what we did is, out of that fund, we transfer 8 million. So now we've created what we call a local bridge improvement grant, which has 15 million. 8 million is coming from the state gas tax increases, and the 7 million is coming from local government that we allow those increases on those license plates and on those weight of vehicles. Also, the other thing that we did is that we said that counties had the authority to assess about $5 a wheel on vehicles up to a maximum of 12 wheels. And I will tell you that is flexible in the state as well as the taxation at the local level. So counties can decide if they want to do that or not. So with the 15 million that we have out there now for the bridge fund, we attested to the fact that we needed to incentivize those counties that wanted to apply for that bridge fund because they were getting extra dollars that were coming to the county that could be used as a match, and we were providing a 15 million grant program. And what we told them that was, in order to be eligible for these big grants for the bridges, one, they had to have a strategic 5-year transportation plan that was in place, and that was, certainly a well-defined plan as to how they were going to do improvement on their bridges and what the timeframes were. And the other thing, as an incentive, we said, if you want to implement this, then you have to implement a wheel tax. We didn't say how much per wheel, but we said you had to. And I think what we were trying to do was to get them to be part of this. I mean, if we're going to give you a grant, you've got to be a player and willing to pony up to the plate. And so they did that. The one piece of the whole irony of this whole thing was at the end of the day, this went through the House, got amended, all these things that I talked about got on there, as well as into the Senate, because the Senate was the lead on that came over to the House. Well, it ended up in a conference committee, and the majority leader of the House is part of that conference committee. And of course, the House has members in the Senate. And it was in his purview that he knew he had a golden touch, because he wanted to amend that final bill with all this funding to say that we could raise the speed limit on our interstate system to 80 miles per hour rather than 70 or 75. You know, in South Dakota, once you leave the Sioux Falls area or you leave the Black Hills, you have a straight shot, not much hills. And he drove that a lot. And he really felt that we needed to increase that speed limit. So in conference committee, he knew he had a done deal, because we all had come to the table. We agreed, the counties, the townships, they were all willing to take that, very excited about the program that was there, and saw a return on their investment. And they saw something they could take back to their constituents, to their counties, to their townships, that we could have access to those bridge dollars and make some improvement. And at the end of the day, that bill was passed. And today, that's what we have right now operating in the state of South Dakota. I will stand by for any questions that you have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jean. That was extremely informative. And if anyone has questions, make sure you pop them in the Q&A box, and we can address them after our brief discussion among the panelists. So I'd like to ask Samantha and Ken to turn their videos on. So Samantha Harkins is joining us. She's the Deputy Mayor of Lansing, Michigan. In the past, she has worked for Munetrix, the Michigan Municipal League, the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Michigan House of Representatives, and the City of Norfolk in Virginia. And then Ken Sikkema currently works for the Public Sector Consultants in Michigan. And prior to that, he served in the Michigan legislature for 20 years in both capacities as senator and representative. Thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to kick off this little discussion between the panelists. And I will start with and Jean, feel free to pipe in whenever you want. And I'll start with Samantha. So many people say that local governments in Michigan and in a lot of other states do not need more money. Can you talk a little bit about why, even before COVID-19 hit, that localities, and at least several localities in Michigan, needed access to more funds?
Well, thank you, Jenna, for having me. And I have to say, when I moved to Michigan 15 years ago, Ken was the Senate Majority Leader. So I feel like being on the webinar with him now means I've finally made it. So thank you for having me. But you know, one of the, you mentioned this in your presentation, we have some real challenges for local units of government. We are capped at the amounts that we can levy, and we're capped on growth because of our proposed way in Headley, our constitutional amendments. So we're capped at 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever is less. And as we all know, the last 3 or 4 years has been the 2-ish% mark. So caps on growth mean we're still recovering from the 2008 recession. And then in addition to that, state revenue sharing is down billions of dollars in the last 20 years. So we're really this perfect storm of lack of revenue. On the other side of that, the cost of providing services has grown. And so as the tax bases for our cities have diminished, the ability to provide services has become even more challenging. We have this in Lansing, we have a significant unfunded pension and retiree healthcare liability, which is a significant portion of our budget, and that continues to grow every year. And so our residents still have an expectation that we provide certain services. I live downtown, I expect my trash to be picked up, I expect my toilet to flush, I expect clean, safe park within walking distance, and it costs a lot to provide those services. So I think it's just been particularly challenging for local units of government in the last few decades to continue to provide that service. And if I may take a point of privilege, I wanted to also talk about the first question in the chat box. It's one of our city council members, Councilmember Betts. He has a really important point that we have to be equitable about how we raise revenue. One of the challenges is in a city like Lansing, where we have higher poverty rates and lower per capita income, there's a real inequitable gap between us and the suburban communities. And so, Jenna, you mentioned that state and local governments have to really work together. I think there's an opportunity here for the state to help bridge that gap. Otherwise, it will just continue to, the suburbs will continue to have more revenue and cities will continue to sort of be much more challenged in our residents as well. So I think that's a really, as we talk about the solutions here, we have to talk about an equitable solution.
Thank you. Ken, you're a Republican. You get this. You get that. You understand these issues, and you recognize that there needs to be change. Just last year, you recommended that the state should increase the gas and diesel fuel taxes gradually over the next several years to help pay for transportation infrastructure improvements. Do you want to talk a little bit about that proposal and why Michigan desperately needs these funds?
Well, I'd be happy to. Actually, Representative Hunhoff from South Dakota just gave me a great idea. Maybe if we said you could drive 80 miles per hour on the expressways in Michigan, we might be able to get some traction on some of these issues. Now, I joined with Bob Emerson and John Cherry and Paul Hilligans. Bob and John, former Democratic leaders. Paul Hilligans, former Republican Speaker of the House, about 2 years ago, and proposing a gas tax increase, statewide gas tax increase, because like South Dakota, we have a real need for roads and bridges. I think the challenge, and let me just say this, Jenna, the state has a vital interest in fiscally stable local governments, because at the end of the day, if there's a problem, it ultimately comes back to the state to resolve in one way or another. And to be candid about it, the state always hasn't done a great job of doing it. And for example, Flint being the poster child for the state not doing a great job. It was a state-appointed emergency manager situation when the lead contamination of the water supply occurred. Now, there have been, to be honest and fair about it, there have been other situations, both with local units of government and school districts, where the state's involvement has probably been a benefit. But ultimately, the point here is the state has a real interest in fiscally stable local governments. I will say this, and you and I and Samantha talked a little bit about this in kind of a pre-call earlier this week. I think the real problem or the real challenge is that it's hard to make this a public issue, except for places like maybe a Flint or a Detroit, or where it does become a public issue. Most of us in Michigan probably live in cities or townships that we don't see any problem. I mean, for example, I live in the city of Wyoming, and when I turn the water on, it's there. It's apparently safe. The street gets plowed most of the time when it needs it. There seems to be adequate police and fire. So, and I think Samantha actually hit the nail on the head earlier this week when she had said that local governments have done such a great job of dealing with these fiscal problems that a lot of us as citizens don't see it readily. And that's I think a big challenge to sort of address or overcome when it comes to addressing the problems you articulated in your report, which I would say is a very good report. I mean, okay, maybe there's not a lot of new in it, although I think there is some new things in it, but it's important to kind of bring this back to our attention on a regular basis.
Thank you, Ken, for the kind words on the report. And you make some really great points. Like you said, that a lot of this isn't new to all the people that are listening, or both of you, but do you have suggestions for how we can move this issue forward? I think we've been gaining some traction with this the stakeholder meetings we've been having and producing this research. But is there anyone or certain stakeholders that haven't been at the table that we need to get to? Is this going to need to be a public education campaign? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think Representative Hunhoff from South Dakota made a really good point when she explained how they sort of figured out they had to do a lot of collaboration and that there had to be a lot of winners at the end of the day. I think that's a really good point. The one thing in the report that really resonated with me was this concept, which I had not encountered before, of network enterprise. Because if cities or local units of government, it's not just cities, right? It's townships, counties, villages. If we kind of rethink how we solve problems, like, for example, high school graduation rate was mentioned as an example in your report, or addressing poverty, where cities become a part of that solution, that really resonated with me, because now I think you're talking potentially about issues that do resonate with citizens rather than just, hey, my city needs more money. So I thought this network enterprise concept was more than just a clever phrase. I thought you're really onto something there that I think needs to be fleshed out and explored in more detail.
I think Ken makes a really good point about collaboration. And I think that, Jenna, you had the slide in your presentation about the sheer number of local units of government in Michigan. We don't do collaboration that well, right? Lansing is a city. We have East Lansing next to us, and we are surrounded by 5 urban townships. We don't do much with any of them. And there's a lot of, it's on our end as well, there's a lot of territorial nature for the governments all across Michigan. So to really collaborate and really work together, we have to think about what we're doing that's best for our residents and for our communities, and stop thinking about what's best for our specific city. Because, if Lansing fails, East Lansing and all the surrounding suburbs would fail as well, right? And that's the same is true for any, pocket of communities in Michigan. And so I think we need to start thinking more broadly about regional and statewide implications, and stop thinking about really in an insular way about our own community. And then another issue is, I think, Ken started to say this, and I think we need to reframe the issue entirely. I know I was at the Michigan Municipal League for 8.5 years, worked on municipal finance. And I know our talking point when I was there, and I don't think, this is still a talking point, is the state legislature has cut, when I was there, left 4 years ago, it was like $6.5 billion in state revenue sharing. That doesn't resonate with legislators. And with our strict term limits, if you're a legislator who's been there 2 years and someone comes in and says, you cut our revenue sharing, give it back, they're like, I haven't been here for 20 years. I didn't cut your revenue sharing. It's become a very sort of a talking point that has made legislators defensive, I think. So I think as we move forward, we have to think about how to bring everyone together. And as Ken said, the state has a real interest in fiscally strong local units of government. We have to think about how we move forward from this point, stop focusing on the fact that state revenue sharing is cut. It's cut, it's not coming back. Let's move on and figure out what we do from here going forward, because that argument is not working anymore.
I hear you. Thank you. Bill Anderson put a question in the chat, which actually I was going to sort of ask you about. He said that the chair of the Federal Reserve stated that our economy may have just changed forever. Alternative funding sources like city income taxes and taxation of office buildings are changing before our eyes. And so when we spoke earlier this week, Samantha, you talked about the income tax and how that's going to change with COVID. And so for people who don't know, cities in Michigan can levy an income tax, but no other form of government can. And so can you explain a little bit about how, people working from home now is affecting the city's ability to collect the income tax, which is a critical tax for cities?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. So there are 24 Michigan cities, including the city of Lansing, that levy an income tax. Non-residents pay a percentage of that. In 20 of those cities, it's 0.5%. In the other 4, there's some different variations. But it's based on where the employee is working. And so Lansing's a great example. We have thousands of state employees who are usually here in our city working. I mean, I can see the Capitol from my house, right? They're working right across the street. and now they're working remotely until further notice. And so they can change their tax withholding so that it's based on the community in which they are working. And so if you live in a non-income tax city, you could say, I don't want to pay this 0.5%, and that money would no longer be given to the city of Lansing or Detroit or Grand Rapids or any other city that levies an income tax. So according to the State Department of Treasury, the impact of that in total to the 24 cities could be between $120 to $160 million, which is a lot of money. So the Michigan Municipal League is working on legislation right now to freeze income tax that has been for employers that have been closed because of COVID. So that would be a really important change for cities like ours and the other 23 cities. But it could really significantly impact revenues for income tax levying cities.
Wow, thank you. I will read Rick's question in the chat. I'm not skipping you, Brandon. I'll get back to you. I know because Samantha already sort of answered it a little bit. So Rick's question is, some Pennsylvania communities have reformed their property tax by reducing the tax rate applied to privately created building values while increasing the tax rate applied to community created land values. This reform, without increasing spending or reducing revenues, makes both buildings and land more affordable while encouraging more compact development. Would this make sense for communities in the Midwest?
So I would be curious if Rick's talking about land value taxation, because I know that's something that we explored a few years ago, and it's a really interesting concept where you basically charge more. So if someone is buying up land and they're speculating and they're not actually building on the land and not actually creating tax revenue for the local government, it would almost be penalized based on the tax rate, which I think is really interesting. I think it would require legislative changes, but I think it's a really interesting concept, especially for communities that have a lot of land being held by someone just waiting for the right time to build, and it could instead be creating revenue for the local unit of government. So I'm not sure if that's what he's talking about or a similar concept, but I think it's a really interesting idea.
Ken, do you have any thoughts? Don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I probably would need it explained a little bit more in detail to me. I mean, anything arguably that encourages development, if you use the property tax, eventually that helps, right? I mean, if you have more development, you're going to have more bigger tax base. But I guess we've operated under a system for many years where we say that, well, if we give some big enterprise a tax break, we somehow all benefit later on by increased, income taxes or whatever. And I'm not sure it's always played out quite like that. So I'd be a little cautious if the argument is, let's reduce taxes because it leads to more economic development, which then leads to more revenue at some point. I mean, I'm guessing he's not making that argument, but it sort of sounded a little bit like that. And I'd be once again, a little cautious about going down that path, which I think we've been down before.
If anything, it's Pennsylvania is an example we should look more into and learn more about before we think about.
Well, I think, yeah, we ought to be open to all kinds of ideas. I probably shouldn't keep saying this, but I'm kind of enamored with the 80 miles per hour idea in South Dakota, but for different reasons. But we shouldn't be throwing cold water on anything really at this point, right? I mean, it's a big problem. It's a serious problem. The state has an interest, as I mentioned, as do local units of government. And as Samantha said quite eloquently, we got to think outside the box here because the old arguments aren't working.
Yes, definitely. So now I'll go back to Brandon's question and we can talk about that a little bit more. What are your thoughts on the racial equity implications of increasing regressive taxes like the sales tax or property taxes? How should the legislature most equitably fund local governments? I mean, I know at the Lincoln Institute, we don't really think of the property tax as regressive, but yes, it can be, obviously, but there are a lot of ways you can build your system so that it can be more progressive. You have property tax abatements and circuit breakers, and you attempt to help or lessen the burden on the people who can't afford their property taxes, like the elderly. But I'm curious if either of you have any want to say anything about or answer Brandon's question.
Yeah, I think another interesting piece would be, and we talk about the statutory revenue sharing formula, that's something that everyone, not everyone, as city people, we always want to look at, and it hasn't been changed in decades. And I think what's really interesting is there could be a component of the statutory revenue sharing formula, if you reworked it, that for communities that have more challenges that create an inequitable balance between the suburban communities and the more urban core communities, you could, shift revenue that way. I mean, I know that has happened with school funding a bit. And I think that, older communities just have bigger challenges. It just simply is a fact. And so I think as we continue to spread out services and sprawl further into suburban communities, it becomes more challenging for those urban core communities. And when we talk about equity, I don't know that, we're not going to get away from property tax. It's, I actually pulled it up because I couldn't remember. Property tax is 30% of Lansing's budget. We're obviously not going to get away from property tax, but I think that especially in some of these formulas from the state and things like that, we could add in equity components. I think they could really level that playing field or start to.
Well, I think Brandon makes a good point, and to some extent, all taxes are going to be regressive. I mean, you can, for example, the income tax, Michigan does not have a progressive rate income tax. You'd have to change the Constitution, so you can modify taxes to some extent to try to reduce their regressivity, but all taxes, I think, are generally going to be regressive. Now, the sales tax is not on food and medicine in Michigan to help, once again, help sort of deal with that. But I think we need to, it's a good point. We need to recognize it, and we need to do things to like I said, to sort of address it. For example, I'm a big fan of increasing the earned income tax credit, because it's a tax credit for low income working people. And if you expand that, and we have it in Michigan, as they do at the federal level, that would, and you couple it with some kind of other taxation that we're imposing or allowing local units to impose, that can help deal with the regressive nature of a sales tax or a property tax increase or whatever. But it's a good point, and I think we need to do things to try to reduce the regressive nature of most taxes.
Agreed. Thank you. Jean, I'm curious if you want to pipe in after hearing a little bit more about the issues in Michigan and hearing that Ken's really interested in the 80 miles an hour for highways. If you have any advice or any.
Well, Jenna, let me say to Jean, hey, Jean, I've driven in South Dakota long before they legally were allowed to drive 80 miles an hour. And I'm telling you, everybody was driving 80 miles an hour.
And I don't disagree. So now everybody's driving 90 miles an hour, including me. I'm 4 hours from the Capitol. So, yep, you got it. I appreciate this opportunity. And I think, again, the difference is where you're talking large populations, but I think the concepts are similar in the senses that you've got to bring people together to see what they're going to win out of this. I mean, that's no matter what you're doing in your taxation, people want to know that if I'm going to pay 3 cents more, or if I'm going to pay whatever, what am I getting for that? And when you build your coalitions, and you were talking about a network enterprise or whatever, and I'm sure you're doing that, but even in your locales that you're talking about and some of the comments that have been made, getting to those people that are the movers and the shakers. And again, how do I win out of this? I'll pay you the 3 cents more, but am I going to have that swimming pool, or am I going to have my streets cleaned, or am I going to have this? Because I think we all see that whenever there are bond issues or there are anything and they win, you go back and you assess, and it's like, it becomes my passion. And if it's my passion, I'm going to be willing to do this. But you get the passionate people to carry the water for you, that this is the improvement we're going to have. And then at the end of the day, whatever that is, you can come back and say, wow, this is great. It worked. We have this, and local government can fund this or whatever. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think sometimes when you're in government, you're in a bureaucracy and people feel like they're isolated and they want to get into it. And it's how you bring them in and have them take that active participation and that lead by the hand to get them to help you win this.
Thank you, Jean, for your perspective. I am going to give you all the chance to have any final words, get on your soapbox. Is there anything you want to talk about, advocate for? I will briefly say that, having worked on this project for almost 2 years now, the Lincoln Institute is, we're invested in Michigan now, and we hope to continue to be a convener and find some more people on the ground who could be champions for moving these issues and advancing state policy around this matter forward. Ken, do you want to say any final thoughts?
Well, I think I like the report because it sort of positions this properly for the future. And I think, as I mentioned about the network enterprise concept, I think there are some things in there that are new and potentially useful. I do think Samantha was right. It's time to rethink how to, I guess, position the issue as sort of a public relations word. I mean, how to advance this issue in the new environment that we're entering. I think Bill Anderson is right. It's going to be a new world here, even post-COVID. But I think Samantha is on to something about it's really time to sort of reposition, refocus, what's going to work going up the road here.
Great, thank you. Samantha?
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Working with you and Jesse Grogan at the Lincoln Institute has been wonderful. And thank you for the report. And I know when y'all were here last year, we met at the Lansing Chamber, and we have a great partnership with our local chamber. We have this great group of people, including Ken and myself. I'm just saying we're great. That wasn't where I was going, but I'm including us in this room, a great group of really diverse stakeholders. And I think that's what's really important about this issue is we all live somewhere and we all enjoy where we live, whether it's downtown Lansing or Wyoming or any other community in Michigan or outside of Michigan. And we want to see our communities thrive. And I did say this earlier this week that local government has done a wonderful job of continuing to provide services and not letting the public know how tough it's been. And I hope we continue to do that, and we can continue to do that. But when we get to the point where we don't have street lights and our streets plowed and we don't have safe and livable and viable communities, that's going to really start to affect the residents. And I think that it's really important that we tackle this issue before we get there. And I think that's just I think our timing is right, and we need to really start getting on this in the next few years.
Thank you. Jean, just want to check with you. Do you have anything else you want to share? Or?
Just one, I want to say thank you. I've learned a lot from this conversation. It's good to get outside my state and my box, but I will tell you, my husband and I own a fitness center in a town 18 miles away. It's a town of 400, and every morning I go over at 4:30, open it up and work out. And I listen to a national radio station, and almost every other morning, Patty Poppy, who is with some chemical company in Michigan, comes on with her ad about come to Michigan. We're open for business. We have the best business climate. So you must be doing something right, because she makes it sound like things are working. So maybe it's I don't know what, but she's painting a picture that you're doing well. So continue in your endeavors, and Patty Poppy is encouraging you to do that.
Ken, you're going to tell her the irony?
Well, the irony is that we just lost Patty Poppy, Jean. She was chief executive officer of Consumers Power, a big utility, and Pacific Gas and Electric in California just stole her. So we're going to have to find a new Patty Poppy.
Well, you got a listener, so I'll be listening to your new spokesperson then, who's promoting Michigan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. We can end a little early. Thank you, Amy, Samantha, Ken, Jean. I appreciate you all joining us, and for the participants for listening. This is recorded, so it will be available eventually on our website, and hopefully you can share with others. I really hope you all learned something new, at least today. And please, if you have any questions or concerns, reach out to me, DeAngelo at lincolninst.edu, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.